Jack.
Begin. To this IA webinar, which will provide an overview of the Resource and Environment Working Group paper, Flood Risk. Our presenters today are Sam Gutterman, Stuart Mathewson, and Muslin. For our listeners, please note that this webinar is being recorded. The slides and the recording will be posted to our website later today. Questions throughout the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box that you will see on your screen. The questions will be responded to at the end of the webinar. Let me introduce Ray Muslin, who will be our first presenter today.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the Resource and Environment Working Group's Flood Risk webinar. Next slide, please. So, by way of introduction, we now, next slide, would like to just give you a brief introduction to IAA. I'm sure most of you already know that we're the International Association of Actuarial Associations. We have over 5,000 section members, almost 800 plus volunteers, and most recently, I'd like to welcome our latest full member, which is Nigeria. Next slide. And this gives a visual map of all the associations that are members of the IAA. As you see, we've got wide coverage of members in all parts of the world, and we strive very hard to try to develop content relevant to all of our member associations. Next slide. The Resource and Environmental Working Group has been very active in the past several years. We've put out papers on climate change and mortality, decarbonization, this paper on flood risk, which we're talking about now, and a discussion of climate change insurance and vulnerable populations. These papers are available on the website. We're also working including papers on water quality, climate change adaptation, disclosure for pension plans due to climate change, and a chapter for the IAA risk book on climate change risk. Next. The paper that we're covering today is broken up into sections. We cover in the beginning the sort of an introduction to what flood risk is and what flood risk management is. We're then going to talk a little bit about the role of insurance in managing flood risk and how insurance is priced with Stuart, and then I am going to return and talk about things that constrain the insurance system and which those constraints often lead to government taking actions to get involved in the flood insurance market. And I'll close with a discussion of how actuaries the role of actuaries in the flood insurance world. Next. So now talking about flood risk itself, we can start with some definitions. Basically, flood is when you have a lot of water and too much of it and it doesn't have anywhere to go. There's really three types of floods we're going to talk about in this paper. There's coastal or storm surge floods. These occur in tidal areas or importantly along the large lakes or reservoirs that are big enough to have tidal effects. There's riverine or fluvial floods, which are basically an overflow of rivers, normally dry land. And finally, there are flash floods. They're called surface floods or pluvial floods, which result in ponding of water due to intense rainfall over a short period of time. And importantly, flash floods can occur almost anywhere, and they are not necessarily occurring close to a body of water. That makes designing insurance products and pricing for them for this particular type of flood particularly challenging. Next slide. As you can see on this slide, we've shown the percentage of occurrences of natural disasters by type over about a 20-year period. And what you'll see here is that flood is represents almost half of the natural disasters that have occurred in the last 20 years. So it's very significant peril, though if you investigate the actuarial literature and other sources of information for actuaries working in the area of floods, there's a relative absence of material on flood, which is one of the reasons we're motivated to prepare the report that we're presenting today. Next slide. So if you look at the magnitude of the losses, they're estimated in 2013 values, an older estimate, but the economic losses due to floods exceeded $1 trillion during the period shown. And this was composed of both direct and indirect losses. There's tangible losses, which are physical losses to homes, businesses, vehicles, property, roads, infrastructure, and other intangible types, which are resulting in injuries, deaths, lost tax revenue, etc. Next slide. This table presents characteristics of the three types of floods I presented earlier. I'm not going to read the whole slide, but I will point out that coastal floods include due to being pushed on shore by wind, high waves, and also tsunamis. Because tsunami is a particularly unique peril that results from a combination of underwater earthquakes and has a somewhat different source than most of the other types of floods, which are due to weather events. Our paper doesn't really cover tsunamis particularly, but we note they're a significant component of flood risk in coastal areas. Coastal floods generally only affects small areas near the coast. The loss prevention methodologies on coastal floods include things like land use rules to prevent people from building too close to the ocean, dikes, seawalls, and other barriers. And obviously, when there's a big event, at least a weather-driven event, there's usually significant and people are able to evacuate. Climate change is likely to make this particular peril quite significant, and it's really only going to increase in intensity, unlike potentially other ones, because the sea level rise is being fueled by glacial ice melt. Importantly, it's only the land ice melting that contributes to rising sea levels. Sea ice melting does generally not contribute to sea level rise, but we're seeing significant rise in sea levels and also some increase in some increase in the intensity of intense tropical cyclones, which also exacerbates the issues with coastal flooding due to coastal flooding. The other thing I'd mention is that as oceans warm, they expand, and the water therefore expands, and it further contributes to sea level rise. Riverine floods tend to occur over a long period of time due to large precipitation events such as those caused by tropical cyclones stalling over land, as we saw with Hurricane Harvey in Texas. They can occur repeatedly in areas near rivers. They can have significant impact over a long period of time. And generally, loss prevention is well advanced for this particular type of flood. You've got land use, like don't build too close to the water. You can use structural flood control, dikes, levees, and other methods to contain water within rivers. You can temporarily protect property with sandbags, and you can certainly evacuate because there's usually quite a lot of warning when these floods occur. Climate change has an uncertain effect. In many cases, the melting of glaciers and increased rainfall will make the risk of riverine flood greater, but it should be noted that other parts of the world, in some parts of the world, we may experience decreased rainfall, increased drought, and perhaps a reduction in riverine floods. So this is a case where not all climate change effects are going to go in unlike the effect of coastal flooding. Briefly covering flash floods, these mostly occur in local conditions due to torrential rain from severe convective storms. They can occur virtually anywhere. The loss factors are sudden or onrushing of fast flowing water. And the loss prevention methodologies are much more difficult because they can occur anywhere. They're generally not associated with a specific river system. Important in places, say like Florida, subject to large rainfalls. You need adequate drainage. So when you put parking lots in, you have to provide places to drain. You've got to effectively build buildings and maintain them. And in this case, unlike the others, you largely have to do quick evacuations because you generally have relatively little warning. Finally, climate change on this should result in more intense rain in many locations and potentially more extreme category 4 and 5 cyclones and perhaps stalling cyclones as we saw in Texas and recently North Carolina. Next slide. So the types, the things that drive flood are the weather, obviously, and also the geography, because obviously how water flows on a certain, over the land is important. You've also got physical land features like mountains, valleys, and in some cases, even blockades of rivers due to earthquakes or landslides. And you've also have human factors that cause or contribute to floods, such as improper land use, paving over wetlands, structural failure of dikes and levees, inadequate infrastructure, and a host of other things that when actuaries are assessing flood risk need to be considered. And increased urbanization contributes in many ways, not only by changing drainage patterns, but also by potentially increasing land subsidence in cities like Bangkok and Jakarta are examples of that, where very heavy buildings placed on very soft soil sometimes result in sinkage, and that can increase the risk of flood. Next slide. And then on top of that, there are factors that exacerbate the what I call the normal contributors to flood that we think about, which, as I mentioned earlier, include sea level rise, melting glaciers, potentially increased rainfall from climate change, and more intense or stalling cyclones. And as I mentioned earlier, we did not cover tsunami risk in this paper. Next slide. So importantly, flood is a risk that changes over time. And just because we have a flood map that's correct for today, or because we have the flood risk with a model as it exists today, we are not necessarily going to see the same risk in the future. And things that drive those changes are certainly rivers meander and change their course and the depth of the water flow. Certainly as people move to air near water, the risk can increase or decrease. And we have climate change, as mentioned earlier. And certainly a key factor in flood risk is the willingness of societies to invest in flood mitigation and adaptation activities over time. Next. I'm going to just briefly cover flood risk management. Next slide.
Right, maybe we can check to see if Sam's back now. Are you there?
Yes.
Oh, Sam,
okay.
If you take over, that would be fine. Thank you.
Over for Sam.
Sorry.
Management.
Sorry for the technical difficulty.
Go ahead, Sam. Sam, go ahead. You're on.
Okay, good. Thanks, and sorry for the technical difficulties. Briefly talk about. I hope I'm on.
Go ahead. You're on. We're on the flood risk management process.
Okay, great. As you can see, this is it for most people who are familiar with the actuarial control. flood risk management can be controlled by a process. In looking at it in terms of 6 different steps. First, identify the problem. Most areas, one way, as Ray mentioned. But in order to do that, you have to properly assess the risks, and that implies not only but also mitigation and adaptation approaches that could be taken to address this issue. After that adaptation that has been taken by the community and the individual insured or the individual, this next step is to quantify the risks. Once you've quantified and understood the risks, then you identify what means that you transfer that risk from the individual or business or the government to an insurer if there's insurer involved. Once you've got that in place, however, you'll see a dynamic risk that can be changed not only over time, but during the event. Next slide. Going back to a couple of those stages in a little more detail is the mitigation and adaptation stage. There are actions that both the private sector and the public sector can take to try to eliminate. We're never going to eliminate floods, but we're going to be eliminating some of the damages that can be caused by floods. They're particularly relevant, as Ray mentioned, in floodplains, and almost a separate process, that is the management of those floodplains. Also mentioned land use and enhancing the resiliency of the buildings, but also an early warning system. California just this week has started to put in place an advanced early warning system for earthquakes, but in particular in Bangladesh, they have a exceedingly good warning. We've been able to reduce losses in terms of lives by tens of thousands in a cyclone flood event. There are alternative approaches to financing via private insurance in some countries, public programs, and hopefully in most cases, private and public combination or hybrid programs. But bottom line, through public safety nets and particularly community involvement, you've seen some of the most heartwarming events when you turn on your internet to flood events is helpfulness of the community. There is a next.
See it, Sam. It's measurement flood risk characteristics. Measurement flood risk characteristics.
I'm only seeing the mitigation and adaptations. Maybe you could.
Me, it's Chris.
Let me take over. I can take over, Christian.
Hello?
Okay. Apologies to our for Sam's technical difficulties. I'll just take over his section here. So if we look at this slide, this refers to the measurement of flood risk, and the things that we need to really consider here are the individual exposures that are subject to flood, the certainly whether we have low frequency and high severity events. We've got to be aware of current flood control measures. We've got to be aware of the scope of damages, the degree to which risk is concentrated, what granularity data we have, and the correlation and causation of flood losses within a book of business. Next slide, please. And at that point, we're now going to go to Stuart, who's going to now talk about the role of insurance and also cover actuarial rate-making techniques for flood insurance. Stuart?
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. Yeah, so when we talk about managing flood risk, one of the first things we want to talk about is the role of insurance. So I'm going to start with just a definition of a protection gap, which exists when you've got a difference between the financial needs of individuals and businesses after a catastrophe and the funds available. So a primary objective of public programs, private sector insurers, and public-private initiatives is to minimize that gap. In the event of a severe flood, the protection gap can create significant strain on the resources of those in the flooded area. In addition to the fact that you've got lots and lots of buildings that need to be fixed, you have cleanup, you have infrastructure where the roads maybe are impassable. So there's significant strain on resources. Next slide, please. So there are a couple types of relevant insurance that can address the three major types of flood. Most commonly is property insurance. The issue here often is that flood is excluded from many personal and small commercial property policies. This is particularly true in the United States, but it's true other places also. Flood tends to be included in large commercial known as all risk policies, but when it's excluded, there is a need for a specialized coverage just covering flood. But you should note also that life and health policies can be exposed to flood risk, especially in places where loss of life or significant health risk come about. Next slide, please. There are a number of challenges associated with flood risk. I'll get into this one later, but the availability of high quality data sufficient and reliable for rate making is very tricky. Also, as Ray pointed out a bit, there are changing conditions that make historical data less relevant in the projection of future losses. Those can be changes in the location, it can be changes in the weather. Also, ensuring flood is very sensitive to variations in local differences in geography and also relatively small differences in land and building elevation. So you can have a couple of buildings side by side. If one happens to be elevated by even a couple of feet, this can make a difference when a river is rising. Another issue that we run into all the time is low penetration. So very few people are buying it in many cases. Either they don't know about it, they're not aware, or there's a misperception about the real risk of flood to them. Excuse me. One example of this is in the United States, where the NFIP, the National Flood Program, has rules that people should be buying flood insurance in the floodplain of a 100-year flood, but much of the damage actually happens outside of that, and people are just not aware that they are susceptible. Next slide, please. In addition, there's limited interest in spending money for mitigation and adaptation activities. There are good reasons for that, in that they can be quite expensive for the individual, and it can be uncertain whether those actually do you a lot of good. What really has to happen is the community needs to spend its money to safeguard the entire community. Also, adverse selection cuts in here, where only consumers with actual or perceived risk are going to purchase the flood insurance. What this means in practice is if you're trying to provide flood insurance, if only the people that are going to have floods are going to be buying insurance, the premiums to actually cover all of that can be prohibitive. We're also running into a lot of population growth and overconcentration in areas prone to flooding. This is particularly true along the coasts where as people like to live on water. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are some public approaches, there are some private approaches. Pure public approaches include things like post-event government assistance. I believe that's kind of the way things work in the Netherlands. FEMA in the United States has some assistance, but it's not very comprehensive. There are also government agencies providing flood insurance either directly or through intermediaries. Private sector includes local, national, international insurers and reinsurers. It is possible for private premiums to be set consistent with risk characteristics that are involved. And this would send price signals to promote prevention, promote mitigation, while also remaining self-supporting for non-cat catastrophe losses. The question is then, is this affordable enough to be sold in the market? Next slide, please. There are some public-private approaches that juxtapose a state guarantee, for instance, a public reinsurance with private insurance. This would limit insurers' payouts to amounts that could be insured through affordable premiums. One example of a public-private partnership is in the United States, where we have write your own insurers, where the insurer actually writes the policy, but the form is the federal form, and the claims are ultimately paid by the government, reimbursing the private insurer. As alluded earlier, market penetration of flood insurance is far from complete, even in flood-prone areas. This causes an issue of just not having enough people paying into the pool. But reliance on a public post-event assistance is going to lead to incomplete or inadequate reconstruction of damaged buildings. One example of this is the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, which is still not back where it was, even though Katrina hit in 2005. Next slide, please. Corporations in particular, or companies, can use self-insurance. Individuals can, but self-insurance is very different from non-insurance. And if you're going to self-insure, you need to build up some sort of funding so that you can pay either large deductibles, self-insured retentions, or you can pay into funds or pooling programs or captive insurance. There are repercussions. If you set aside too small amount for flood risk, and the flood risk happens before you've built up your pool, then you don't have enough to get you back on your feet. But you can also put aside too large an amount of your capital and cause your business to have problems with trying to earn enough money based on all the money you're putting aside on self-insurance. Next slide, please. So flood insurance products can take the form of standalone insurance policies, which only covers flood, or in many parts of the world, it can be bought through an endorsement or as part of a standard property or multi-peril policy. It is important to coordinate with other types of losses. The big one that we run into in the United States is the hurricane. When you have a hurricane, you have wind losses, you have flood losses, and if they're on two separate policies, you need to be able to coordinate those so that you end up with the person being adequately reimbursed. But flood risk is only one of several natural catastrophe risks. So grouping multiple perils may be a way to handle that. That way, if people are insuring against all sorts of multiple perils, you'll get a greater spread of risk. Next. So one thing that happens in flood insurance is that some people often give subsidies to other people. They don't they don't care. That's what the government programs set up, or the premiums can merely be inadequate. Clearly inadequate ones are places where there's really no effective market, but premiums for government programs themselves do not necessarily reflect the expected losses. And they also don't provide a risk margin for funding future events. So to remain sustainable, losses incurred by insureds need, with inadequate revenue, need to be financed by others. This can be taxpayers, can be assessments to insurance companies, which are ultimately paid for by policyholders. Premiums will more likely be reasonable and affordable if insurance is compulsory or there's a high market penetration. So in places where everybody has to pay in, clearly they're building up the pool to a place where you can afford the loss, and yet everybody, nobody has to pay an inordinate amount. Next slide, please. Because of the catastrophic nature of flood, flood events are typically low frequency, high severity events. This means that there's a significant financial volatility. Companies then need to protect themselves against these losses by purchasing reinsurance. It can generally be purchased in the private sector market, but there are public sponsored programs out there also. There are some government programs to protect you from large losses, but reinsurance is a key to keeping the individual insurance company from having to pay more than their capital can actually stand. Next, please. So just real briefly, on the consequences of having limited financial protection, there was a Munich Re report. You can see the title here. The author is Wolfgang Krong. He speaks about disparities in flood protection between developed and developing companies, and he looked at floods in 2017. He was focusing on South Asia, which is one of the poorer areas of the world, but Peru, Colombia, Sierra Leone, and the Congo were also affected that year. It's interesting to note that in absolute terms, losses are often 1 or 2 orders of magnitude greater, greater than in Europe or in America. But people's lives and livelihoods in these poor countries are much more dramatic. Raid mentioned Bangladesh, but places like that, you can have significant loss of life, significant loss of property with no insurance company coverage. Next slide, please. So, summary. So this is, I found was just an interesting quote from Krohn. It has been shown time and again that countries with an effective insurance system against natural hazards are able to return to normal conditions after a disaster much faster than countries without such protection. Whereas the trail of devastation in flood regions of Asia and Africa could still be seen weeks and even months after the event, life in Houston returned almost normal after the flooding from Tropical Storm Harvey. So apart from 1 or 2 telltale signs, it was difficult to find evidence in Houston that there'd been a meter deep water just a short time before. Okay, so going to move on now to actuarial pricing, cost-based pricing. So the next slide. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. I'm going to start with an actuarial principle, and that's the price of any private sector insurance product should adequately provide for all costs associated with the transfer of risk. And that would include losses, all expenses, and a reasonable return to the insurer. Next slide. So clearly, to produce premiums that are in accordance with the actuarial standards and best practices, actuaries need data which is up to date, granular, and of high quality. As was mentioned earlier, flood risk is a function of weather, of other natural disasters, local topography and bathymetry, soils, drainage, building characteristics, and infrastructure. Some infrastructure could be hundreds of miles away, for instance, a large dam. Some of these parameters, which are critical to quantifying the flood risk, can change often and sometimes dramatically. For instance, development of areas near rivers, streams, and seashore changes the topography. You add hard ground cover where water runs off instead of soaking in. Another example is deforestation. Places like Brazil and Indonesia, where you can get devastated flash floods because there's no longer any forest on the hills. Next slide, please. So, although many loss-covering flood events are relatively small, it's the catastrophic floods that result in the largest share of flood-related losses. After floods in the United States in the late 20s, private sector insurers effectively refused to write flood insurance. They deemed it uninsurable. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, many U.S. insurers drastically reduced their writings in hurricanes. So catastrophes affecting insurance companies can decide that they simply don't want to play in the game. For rate-making analysis to produce adequate premiums over time, the long-term catastrophe potential needs to be so, for instance, it's much more straightforward to set flood premiums that cover normal losses, but you need to also add some sort of amount that can add up to build up to pay for that catastrophic loss. Cat losses can be estimated based on average annual losses that account for the possibility of extreme events using actual data or simulated values. But in addition, remember that there's significant uncertainty in estimating annual expected losses for flood. So there needs to be an appropriate risk loading for the profit provision. More specifically then, in quantifying the risk for cat perils, the usefulness of historical loss data actually is quite limited. Actual loss experience can be used to determine the amount of overall premiums over a large geographic area. But for individual rate making, however, other methods are much more useful. Specifically, a flood simulation model produces various metrics, including the AAL, maximum probable loss, a term basically trying to let you know how big a loss you can be hit by with a certain percentage or likelihood. And can also use it to get a risk tolerance at some level of granularity. You can also, then you need to add loadings for cost of reinsurance, expenses, risk margin, and an overall profit load. Next slide, please. So the use of catastrophe models for flood risk is rapidly becoming the market norm, not only in Europe, Asia, and Australia, where they've been used for a while, but also in the US and Canada, where private sector insurance is becoming more widespread. These models use extremely detailed information about the exposures. Now, how high they are, where they are, what the creeks, rivers are, how far they are from the seashore, etc. And they then generate an exhaustive library of potential events that can be simulated for a portfolio of insured properties to generate measures of loss. Computer modeling flood losses, however, can be much more difficult than even earthquakes and hurricanes because of the local character of the flood hazard and the need for detailed physical information. That's next slide. For properties susceptible to cat losses, that is high frequency, low severity, as I said, the uncertainty is quite high. So the size of the risk load has to depend on this uncertainty and the concentration of properties that can be damaged by a single event, and also the insurer's appetite for risk. I'll just leave you with catastrophe models can be very useful in addition in estimating the risk loading for rate making purposes. So next slide takes us back to RAID.
Thank you. Thank you, Stu. Well, now we're going to take the webinar in a somewhat different direction, where I'm going to now kind of talk about some things that affect flood insurance funding frameworks, and also some things that will lead us into reasons why governments sometimes have to form pools to offer coverage that's affordable and available to many, and also talk a little bit about some of the social questions that arise from things like the implementation of modern computer modeling techniques. So with that, let's move to the next slide, please. So the first thing I'd like to get you to think about is that there's a whole lot of stakeholders involved in insurance risk management. And many of those stakeholders have a very different time horizon and perspective what's in the best interest of the public. And I learned this lesson quite hard when I went through losses and tropical cyclones in Florida and saw the tug of war, if you will, between home builders and people wanting stronger building codes and insurers. And I finally understood that it was not due to any of them having malign motivations, but more that they just had different time horizons and perspectives. So if you think about it, there's many people involved in the system that have real motivation to seek near-term rewards. This could be, say, local councils that are trying to generate revenue from building permits, builders or realtors that are trying to sell properties in the next year. If you think about the people who own property and insure it, well, they have a mixture of motivations. Property owners may want to maximize the value of their on sale, and certainly they may not really want the government telling them that they're a high flood risk because it might hurt their resale value. Insurers want to offer coverage and increase market share, but they also have to, make profits for their shareholders. So again, there's a lot of different motivations there. If you think about mitigation, you really have to make long-term investments in order, and very expensive investments often, to avoid something that has a very low probability of occurring in any year. And this clearly leads to a tension between those whose interests are in short-term economic gains and the communities' need for long-term sustainability and resilience. And I think, you know, anybody working in flood risk management's got to appreciate these various stakeholder views and learn to work with them in order to achieve an outcome that's in the public interest. Next slide, please. So the next point I'd like to get into is risk perception, because if people do not have clear perception of risk, they're not going to manage risk. So some prerequisites for good risk perception are high quality data, some tool to interpret that data, and then some mechanism to communicate the economic signals to people that can act on them. So simply having a lot of data and a model does you no good if you don't have an insurance system that's sending the message to the person building the structure as to what the cost of the risk is. And we've seen some breakdowns that are quite enlightening. As Stu mentioned earlier, the U.S. National Flood Insurance Program establishes what I call bright line flood zones, where there's a line that may go down a street in a neighborhood where on one side of the line you're in a flood zone and on the other side of the line you're out of the flood zone. Well, in that case, many people who live there they have no risk just because they're on the other side of the street, because they're not within the flood zone. Well, of course, that's absurd, because in reality, it's a continuous function, and there is no black and white line between where you have flood and where you don't. So in the US, we saw many examples of people who were on the other side of the line not buying flood insurance, and many, you know, hundreds of thousands of people in recent events found themselves underwater and uninsured because they were on the other side of an arbitrary line. In Thailand, I worked in Thailand during the 2011 floods, and there were many large international insurers in Thailand that were insuring things like Honda motor plants and very large industrial risks that were built on rivers that did not adequately allow for those risks in their risk management portfolios, because there were, at the time, very limited models for flood in Thailand. And while people were very clearly watching things like earthquake in Japan or tropical cyclone risk in China, they were paying not enough attention to flood risk in Thailand. And the there is that just because a risk is not modeled does not mean it doesn't exist. And then I think finally that you'd note that changing risk perceptions market disruption. If you have a situation where the risk was unmodeled, unmeasured, unknown, and unpriced for in the past, and then you have a large triggering event, you can end up with a situation where all of a sudden risk perception changes, prices in the market react, and many people who were able to buy very inexpensive insurance in the past may have trouble affording it in the future. So risk perception changes are a very important component of market disruption. Next slide, please. So why would risk perception change and maybe trigger a market disruption? Well, the biggest culprit in recent years has been technological advances. As Stu mentioned, we have better resolution data. We've got, for example, address level pricing as opposed to postcode or perhaps even crest zone pricing in the past. We've got development changing drainage patterns. As I mentioned in Harvey, one of the big issues was the bayous in Texas were paved over with parking lots, which changed the drainage patterns and exacerbated the flooding. You can have flood control measures that can actually work to decrease risk in one area, but then increase it elsewhere. We've seen that in India, where there have been flood control measures on the Ganges that have resulted in water overflowing into places like Nepal and Bangladesh. So you can actually fix a problem in one place and then have it crop up in another. And of course, climate change can increase or decrease risk due to changes in precipitation, drought, tropical cyclone frequencies, or rising sea levels. Next slide, please. Christian. So let's take an example of risk and consider rising sea levels, which is a significant flood risk in coastal areas all around the world. We know that sea levels are rising globally. It's due to, as I mentioned in the first section, a combination of melting ice, thermal expansion, and land subsidence. And it's probably the clearest example of where we may have issues with building codes, because property constructed to withstand today's sea levels may not be viable during the building's design life. If we're designing buildings that are going to last 100 years, we need to be thinking about conditions 100 years in the future when we build things. And in general, building codes globally do not reflect future conditions. Property premiums also tend to reflect next year. They're one-year policies, and according to actuarial principles, those policies have to be priced at a level that contemplates the risk that's going to be faced during the policy term, not the risk that's going to be faced 20 years from now. So as a result, in general, property being constructed today is not receiving proper signals about the risk that will exist in its design life, either from building codes, insurance about that risk. And that's a significant problem. And it's a problem that is one reason that governments need to get involved in this process, because in general, private market pricing will not reflect future conditions. Next slide, please. This just to show an example, this is the Actuaries Climate Index. Actuarial Association, both North America and Australia, have been compiling climate risk index, climate index, that basically measure various climate components such as temperature, rainfall, wind, and sea level that can affect property losses. And this is just one example of the sea level index that clearly shows an increasing trend in the sea levels over the last 20 to 30 years, and that is clearly forecast to increase in the future. And this is an example of where actuaries are contributing to measuring and understanding this risk so that it can be managed in the future. Next slide. Thank you. So when you have changing risk perception, it triggers some social issues, and I have listed a few of them here, and I certainly encourage the audience to think about others. But the first one is like, who is responsible for unaffordable premiums triggered by address level rating or other technological changes? If insurers willingly sold customers policies for $500 10 years ago, and now we discover better risk assessment tools and realize that should have been $10,000 for that risk, whose fault is that? Who's responsible for that? Is that the property owner's fault? Is that the insurance industry's fault? Or is it just an act of God? And more generally, when risk perception changes for whatever reason, should the burden fall on the property owner who's unfortunate enough to have that highly rated risk, or society in general? I would note that in some cases, like where we have genetic testing in health insurance, society has made a decision that perhaps it's not fair to charge people for the result of a genetic test if they have a higher incidence of or probability of some other disease. Is that appropriate in property insurance? What is the responsibility of government authorities who approved building codes and inadequate standards in the past, or allowed people to build in dangerous places? Do they bear some responsibility? And if we consider climate change, in the case of seas, for example, if those are being caused by carbon pollution, who should pay for the losses from rising sea level? The person who lives on the beachfront, or people generating the pollution that's melting the glaciers? There are no actuarial answers to these questions, but I think if you're going to look at flood risk management problems and why we have government intervention, it's important to ask these type of questions and develop an understanding of their answers. Next slide, please. So I think the key questions here are, to what extent should building codes and land use policies reflect future conditions? And to the extent the future is uncertain, how on earth can the cost and benefits of uncertain future conditions be brought into a flood insurance framework? I made a presentation like this to a group of structural engineers. I virtually watched them short circuit, due to them saying, well, all these, this talk of uncertainty, we're structural engineers. We build things there. We have to be certain they work. And really, considering future uncertainty is just something we can't do, so we shouldn't be thinking about it. Unfortunately, the buildings they're constructing are going to be in an uncertain future, and we need to develop ways to forecast that future so we can make better building code and land use decisions. So how can we help? Well, we can certainly extend catastrophe modeling and our other modeling tools to inform this decision making. And we've got to extend our thinking beyond traditional activities. Actuaries have a lot to contribute to this particular topic. And for us, it's not all just about making rates or setting, reserves. There's quite a bit we can contribute to solving these vexing social problems. Next slide, please. So this brings to the role of government. Next slide. When we think about the role of government, it's important to remember that there's a lot of non-insurance government activities which are quite relevant to flood risk and its management. For one thing, are usually the ones that aggregate basic data. They have historical records of floods. They have maps of risk. They have inventories of buildings. And that's a critical function. They also are the people who make the financial investments in dams, levees, management of water resources, disaster assistance, and even relocating population. Indonesia, for example, is talking about moving its capital from Jakarta to another city, partly due to the flood risk problems experienced in Jakarta. And the third thing that governments do, aside from data and financial investment, is they develop land use and building code guidelines, which are critical to the assessment of risk. And if you're setting rates for flood insurance, it's really critical that you understand all of these three factors, where the data from, how much is being invested in loss control, mitigation, and water risk management, and also how the land use and building codes have been developed. Next slide, please. So why is it that flood tends to have government involvement in so many places? Well, I've listed on this slide several triggers for private market failure, and in various countries we've seen examples of all of these. I mentioned as an example the limited coverage of models we saw in Thailand. We have clear exposure to catastrophes in places that are subject to tropical cyclone or extreme rainfall risks. The fourth bullet here is one I want to spend just a moment on, which is the difficulty we face modeling human factors. Not only do we have to model the building stock and the driver of the loss, but you also have to consider probability that infrastructure will fail. I'll give you an example from Australia. There was a dam system put in place in the 1970s to protect Brisbane against flood, and the country went 20, 30 years without major flood issues because of the dams. But then there was a period of extended drought where they let the dams fill up too far to try to save water for drought control. And then when a massive series of cyclones and rain hit, there was not enough time to drain the water out of the catchment. And as a result, there was too much water and the dams failed. That's something that's, well, the dams didn't break, but the dams were to control the water, and they had to release water that flooded large parts of Queensland. And that's just an example of something that's incredibly difficult to model as an actuary. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, there's issues with affordability and the reluctance of people who perceive they have no risk to buy coverage. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've put together some rules by which governments and private sector play. And this is important for actuaries considering government programs to understand. So let's talk about private programs first. Generally, private programs, the risks are that people voluntarily buy the coverage and insurers voluntarily sell it. The funds that are available come from premium, capital, and reinsurance, and critically, they must be available before an event. And we generally in private insurance can only spread risk across what I call space. In other words, in private insurance, all the losses and premiums have to be accounted for during the year the policies are issued. So you generally can't do something like run a large loss, effectively run a negative surplus and then pay it off out of future premiums. That's generally against accounting rules. So therefore, pricing has to reflect risk and the full cost of risk transfer. It's very difficult to cross-subsidize risks in a private system, and the mitigations are strong by pricing and underwriting. By contrast, government programs have a mixture of voluntary and mandatory participation, and generally the government insurer has to sell to all comers. The source of funds is expanded to not only be premiums and accumulated balances and reinsurance, but also external sources are available, such as taxation, general revenues, or assessments. And they need not be available before the event, which means that government programs can often price at a level much below the private sector. The ability to spread risk occurs across both space, which is geographic or lines of business, but also across time, because governments can pay for losses from future revenues by issuing bonds and collecting effectively the premiums in the future. The pricing does not necessarily need to reflect risk, because the government can force one group of people to subsidize another. The pricing, therefore, is generally more coarse and has more cross subsidies. It's easy to cross subsidize in government programs, and the mitigation is generally a combination of pricing and regulation. Next slide. So the key question is for government entities, how much revenue comes from policyholders versus how much comes from other sources like taxation, how much post-event financing is going to be available, and what degree of cross-subsidization is desired. And when you consider government versus private solutions, you have to think about these questions. How can affordability issues be addressed without dampening and mitigate? How can government programs maintain pricing discipline and avoid large deficits? And how can systems that operate with different rules coexist? In many places, government programs, in many cases, compete with private programs, and that can yield very strange results when the two play by different rules. Next slide. So generally, I think it's fair to conclude this section with a few observations. First of all, private sector programs tend to include the ability to select and reject risk, charge premiums that reflect exposure, and have a refined set of risk classification, where government programs tend to use external financing, take all comers, have less refined risk classification, and spread losses over time such that all losses are not financed from current year revenue. Next, please. So I'm going to very quickly cover 5 countries and just tell you a little bit about different approaches around the world. In our paper, we have a table showing countries all across the world and the different frameworks for flood insurance they have. Australia is private sector focused. It does not regulate rates. There's widespread coverage in the market. Almost all policies include some form of flood cover. But it has significant affordability issues for certain high-risk properties because there is no government rate regulation or safety net to temper the prices. Next slide, please. In France, there's an example where there's a state-owned government reinsurer, and you can read about these more in our paper. I'm not going to really cover them in detail, but France is an example of a country with a government reinsurer which basically makes coverage available to all French people. It has significant assessments that are contributed to mitigation projects and uses low-cost reinsurance to create an incentive for private insurers. Next slide. Thailand is an example of a country, as I mentioned before, that experienced a large flood event and had a very poor understanding of risk that led to significant price increase following an event. That prompted the government to create a national catastrophe fund that's funded by assessments on policies and provides coverage to individual small and medium enterprises. Next slide, please. The UK is an example of a country that had long-standing widespread flood coverage, but that the insurance industry started suffering significant losses, which the industry claimed were due to the government's failure to provide proper flood defenses, and while the insurers had to provide coverage. As a result, something called Flood Re was established that allows insurers to place very high-risk policies into Flood Re, which has a way to subsidize premiums and to prevent people in high-risk areas from having to pay the full cost of flood insurance. Its premiums obviously would be inadequate on those policies, so it has the ability to levy assessments on all policies to cover deficits. But importantly, it purchases reinsurance. It's meant to be self-financing and is subject to expiration in 2039. Finally, the next slide talks about the United States, which has most of the flood written in a government program called the NFIP, which was set up to encourage communities to adopt building codes. The law requires significant cross subsidies, limits premium increases, and its previous rate development methods clearly did not contemplate things like Katrina or Harvey, and as a result, it has run deficits that approach 40 billion US dollars if you factor in the debt forgiveness in 2018, I believe. And so it's run huge debts, but it has made insurance affordable for many people. It's encouraged excessive development in high-risk areas. As I mentioned earlier, it does have low participation outside the flood zones, but in the US, a private market is beginning to grow, but the flood program writes the bulk of coverage. So finally, next slide. I'd leave you with these observations on flood frameworks. There's a wide range of these around the world, and our paper covers these in more detail. Almost all of them encourage mitigation. Technological change has been important because it's enabled private markets, but it's created affordability problems for those who've been identified by these tools as being high risk. In all cases, catastrophes are a major driver of issues in the flood market. And really, government decisions about what risks can or cannot be covered in the program is very important. And as you've seen, various countries have taken various approaches, from a hands-off approach in Australia to reinsurance in France to direct insurance in the United States. A lot of examples around the world of different government frameworks that have attempted to provide coverage and address affordability issues. Next slide. So I'm going to conclude just with 3 brief slides on the role of actuaries, and then we'll take some questions. Next. So actuaries have, significant skills that can be brought to bear on a range of flood risk issues. I'm just mentioning a few here. We certainly know how to assess risk. We know how to model. We know how to price insurance products. We understand insurance. We are good at designing risk frameworks. We can quantify the benefits of mitigation activities. And we can also engage in discounting that can compare costs and benefits across time, which is important in flood because in many cases, investments in mitigation today have to account for losses that may occur 30 or 50 years in the future. Next slide. Really importantly to actuaries in this field, we've got to learn to work with other experts and stakeholders. You know, there are certain lines of business and things we do where we can largely stay within the actuarial profession or even within the insurance industry. But with flood, you have to have multidisciplinary teams that include all kinds of disciplines, hydrologists, scientists, government planners, risk management experts. And as I started my sections a while ago talking about, various stakeholder interests have to be understood. There's property owners, governments, builders, taxpayers, et cetera, et cetera. And anybody operating in flood insurance has to understand how all these interests interact. Finally, next slide. Christian. So I think finally, flood risk management's a growth area for actuaries. You know, flood is a major cause of loss around the world, and this flood and generally water management are likely to become much more important due to climate change. Actuaries can make valuable contributions in identifying risk, risk reduction, measuring risk, designing risk transfer mechanisms, monitoring flood and adjusting to climate change. And there's a lot we can do here, and I think it's an extremely exciting area with great opportunities for the profession. And with that, next slide, we can move to questions. Thank you. Christian, you take over?
Yes, Sam, did you want to take over for the questions, or do you want me to do that? You can hear Sam. Okay, so let me start off. I have a question here from George Davis. He says, the ability for government to use cross-subsidization is easy on slide 50. Seems misleading. Those who are expected to pay a subsidy will avoid the government program, leaving the government with a preponderance of underpriced risks. Want to cover that?
Yeah, this is Ray. Can you hear me? Yeah, let me take that. That would be correct if indeed the government did not have mechanisms in its program to compel certain other people to finance the risks. Remember, in a private sector system, risks often have the ability to choose not to buy the coverage or to leave the pool. The reason I said that cost subsidization is easy is because governments have ways to force people to pay more than the fair cost of insurance. That's done through taxes. It can be done by compelling people to buy a product as a mandatory purchase at a subsidized rate. At a flat community leveled rate. And that's done often in health insurance and social programs for age pensions and a whole host of other cases. So, you know, while I agree with the questioner's point that in a private system, you certainly overpriced risks would certainly jump out. My point is that governments have ways through taxation or other sovereign power to compel people to pay for coverage or taxes or something else that can be used to subsidize other people. That's why cross-subsidization is easy.
Okay. Just one question that just came in. Somebody was asking where to find the paper on flood risk. So if you go to the IAA website, which is actuaries.org, and then you would select publications and then papers, it'll be the second paper that you see listed there. The recent paper is the one that was mentioned earlier on climate change, insurance and vulnerable populations. The second paper you'll see on that page will be the flood risk paper. So I'll go. Okay. So the next question I have is from Louise Pryor. She says, have you looked at the role of disaster risk insurance in managing flood risk at the national level? Can help to close the protection gap. Obviously, disaster insurance covers more perils than just flooding.
Do you want to take that, Stu, or you want me to take it?
If you could take it, it'd be great. I'm not sure I quite understand it all.
If I understood the question, I think it's a good point that I think that the point that we're trying to make is that the national frameworks, et cetera, can help close the protection gap. And I think that's absolutely right. So I would agree with the premise of the question. And I think it's a good point.
So the next question I have is from Karen Schmidt. In the US commercial space, one element of self-insurance has been the use of sublimits. After Sandy, many of these sublimits did not survive court challenges. Not a question so much as a comment that this makes the actuary's job more difficult.
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly that that kind of thing certainly does. Obviously, when we try to price things and try to model things, we take the insurance terms into consideration. And if we plug in sublimits and the courts say we can't use them, we're going to miss on that too. So thanks, Karen.
Okay, and just a reminder to our listeners, if you do have any questions, please put them either in the chat window or in the Q&A box and we'll take them over. I have another question here for Stu. The Florida Modeling Commission has helped to improve public understanding of hurricane models for 2 decades. Is there any similar work being done on flood models, and may that have a broader impact outside of the U.S.?
Sure. Just to summarize, for over 2 decades, the Commission has looked at all the commercially available models that have cared to get Commission approval. Theoretically, it is there to allow hurricane models to be used for rate making in Florida, but from a practical standpoint, they're also being used to get the ability to people look at them and say that there's some reason why this model has been approved by somebody, and so it has a wider use than just making rates in Florida. In 2017, the Commission created standards also for flood insurance, and it is due in 2020 to start looking at those models that are willing to come up and try to be approved by the Commission. We'll see how that happens, but there are hopefully a couple of models that will do that. Maybe that it's another year or so till more models come online, but it's clearly the Commission's hope that we get several models using flood models. As far as a broader impact outside the U.S., clearly these modeling organizations getting some sort of credibility rating from the Florida Commission might be in better shape to then look afield to go to other places.
If I just jump in quickly there, Christian, I think the other point of the United States that this is relevant is I think the process that the Florida Modeling Commission put the modelers through in Florida did have a positive effect of, I think really forcing the modeling companies to document a lot of their, methodologies and test them and really justify them and have them challenged by scientific experts outside their organizations. And while there's no direct effect, in many cases the modelers would have done that anyway, I do think that process is probably in some ways, helped strengthen the models a bit, just like running anything through a test would do that. And I think that may be the case in flood models too, if they're run through the Commission.
There's been a lot of discussion on the insurance protection gap. What do you think can be done to reduce that gap? In other words, how can we convince the consumers to buy, I shouldn't say more flood insurance, but at least pay attention to it? Stu or Raid?
Well, I'll start because I think I covered that in my section. I think that goes back to the reason that in the IAA paper we had a whole section on risk perception, and that's why in the paper we quite specifically and quite consciously did not just cover flood risk and actuarial rate making, but we also went into things like risk perception and the constraints discussion I had, et cetera, because I think if you're fundamentally going to change things like the perception gap, you've got to engage in things like consumer education and other things that are going to, increase people's awareness of flood risk and give them an incentive to want to protect themselves against it. And the first step in that is by increasing risk perception. Stu, you have any thoughts on that?
I have just a theoretical thought, and it is mentioned in there, but the fact that we don't have a widespread take up on flood insurance could be helped if companies were to start including flood in all policies all over the country, and charging a little bit for people on top of the mountains and significantly more for people next to the rivers, but nonetheless having it in everybody's policy. And I think, places that do that, I think that was a wise way to go. I don't know how you can make that happen in the United States, but in other places, I think it makes sense too.
And just I would note for the audience that one major difference between the United States and most of the rest of the world is that in much of the rest of the world, property insurance rates are not regulated, and they are regulated in the United States. And whether that has anything to do with insurer reluctance to offer the coverage is for the listener to evaluate. But I think it's important to just note that distinction between the U.S. and some other countries.
I agree also that the fact that public and private sector, I think, need to work together and collaborate on effective education and effective insurance programs. Bottom line, it can't be either private or public sector involvement. We've got to have a broader mix. Ray, just I think we only have questions for maybe one or two other questions, but you mentioned the Actuaries Climate Index in the US, Canada, and Australia. What are there any other such indices, other parts of the world? And is there any way we can further encourage the use of those indices?
Well, there's two comments I'd make quickly. First, that at the moment, those are the only indices being produced, but I'm aware that Europe and the UK specifically are considering developing some sort of index similar to what's been done in those countries. And then the other comment I make is the next step for both Australia and the U.S. is which is I think about to be released in the U.S. fairly soon, and Australia at some point in the future, is a process that ties the climate index, which at the moment just measures things like temperature, rainfall, sea level rise, wind, etc., with actual insurance loss experience, so we can actually at a very granular level and over a period of time look at how the climate index is correlated with changes in losses. And then actually then that could be useful in helping project losses into the future, but that's in the process of being taken.
I'd follow encouragement to all attendees of this webinar to follow the developments in this area and to encourage your individual actuarial association to get involved in better publicizing actuaries' involvement, because I think that there's a significant, as is mentioned, significant role that actuaries can play, both in terms of employees of insurance companies, consultants to insurance companies, and also providing advice to the public. We have maybe a question for one other, and the last closing thoughts from Ray or Stu?
No, I thank everyone for attending, and we have I think we have our email addresses on the next slide. You might want to put that up, Christian, for the audience. We have a disclaimer, of course, that nothing we said we're responsible for or something like that. But You can read that when we print the slides. But on a serious note, here's a slide that shows our email addresses. I'm sure if any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask us, we'd be more than happy to respond to questions if you want to send them to us or if you want more information. And the paper's on the website. And any closing comments from you, Stu?
I want to appreciate the attendees and certainly Ray and Sam for putting this together, and Christian for all your help. Thank you.
And let me just mention that the slide deck and the recording will be posted at the same place as you can find the paper on the website, and that'll be available in a few hours from now. Okay. Much everyone. Thanks, Stuart, Sam, and Raid.